occasionally I do a review, and then current events pop up in a way that, for lack of a better term, makes my review more topical than it was when I did it. So recently I did a review of, well, Designers and Dragons, a 4-volume series by Shannon Appelkline, discussing the history of the tabletop role-playing game industry through the companies and the people who make the games, starting from 1970 and going into the mid-2010s. In the course of that review, I discussed the relevance of, or the value of having read the book in context of the issues that the tabletop role-playing game industry faced with the, for lack of a better term, OGL crisis of 2023, with Wizards of the Coast, likely at the behest of Hasbro, saying that they were going to retract the OGL when they probably couldn't do that, and the hullabaloo over whether they could do that and whether we needed the OGL in the first place, and all this, that, and the other thing, and ultimately leading to the start of the Orc license from Paizo and various other publishers, and various role-playing game publishers like Paizo working to divest their game products from the OGL. Well, at the start of this year, Ben Riggs, who is the author of a oral history of TSR, and Dungeons and Dragons in general, but particularly also TSR, with the book Slaying the Dragon, which is still on my reading list, in spite of what him showing his whole butt. No, not showing his whole butt, but the lack of diligent thought regarding his recent statements, as I guess would be how I describe it, stated that the golden age of role-playing games are dead, and his explanation being that in his words, the splintering of the role-playing game industry, with lots of other publishers doing their own D&D-inspired role-playing game books following the whole OGL fiasco in 2023, that this was going to cause a splintering of the role-playing game market and a collapse of the industry comparable to the failures of TSR, with them spreading out their product lines too much with multiple tabletop role-playing game campaign settings during the end of that company's life. There's a lot of ways I could respond to this. I could describe this as being comparing apples and oranges, because the issue with TSR under those circumstances was that this is a single company having to handle splintering their own literal product line, and with it had the cost of having to support it through publishing books and putting them out through print distribution channels at a time where digital distribution of role-playing game books was not a thing that you could do, causing the company to take on a financial burden that they could not handle, on top of additional issues with how they were literally banking on their paperback print lines, or their paperback fiction print lines, and also on top of this, the not being able to pivot appropriately to the rise of the collectible card game market brought on by Magic the Gathering, leading to the company's collapse financially. Like, this is not that. Paizo stripping a lot of the system reference document material out of Pathfinder isn't that. What's going on with the MGCG role-playing game project isn't that. Labyrinth Lord, or not even Labyrinth Lord, Necrotic Gnome Games taking their Dolmenwood role-playing game setting that they developed for the Old School Essentials role-playing game. I was looking over to my shoulder at the cover to make sure I got the title correct. Old School Essentials role-playing game, and turning that into its own role-playing game that's separate and distinct from the OSE game system. That isn't this. This is multiple companies financially adjusting themselves to limit their potential and hopefully, in their eyes, reduce their potential legal liability by stepping away from from the from the OGL. And also, for that matter, companies that were using the OGL shifting to using the Orc license, also different, because this is people who were already involved in the OGL already now using the Orc license, combined with the fact that the 5th edition rules are now under Creative Commons license, and you can still do both. In terms of you incorporate Creative Commons licensed material within a game, and then have the non-Creative Commons licensed material that you're using be out under the Orc license. I believe those are intercompatible. I'm not a lawyer, don't quote me on that. So for starters, this isn't that. Second, and this is where my review of Designers and Dragons becomes more relevant, is one of the things when you look at an industry holistically as a historian, be it professional or amateur, from a holistic perspective, looking at its history in the broad strokes. And Designers and Dragons definitely gets you that, even if it's like only knee deep or ankle deep, even if it's a encyclopedic view as opposed to a in-depth in-depth historical analysis, deep dive review with lots of academic journals and research and that sort of thing. Even in that perspective, just take that perspective where it's 100 feet up, but still 100 feet up, 100 miles up, but still like in-depth, comprehensive USGS map level quality view of the area. When you look at this from that perspective, diversifying the diversification of the role-playing game market into lots of other games is not new. Dungeons & Dragons has always had a strong grasp on the market, all the way from the jump, from the beginning. But the difference being is there has always been other games and other people playing, changing up how they're playing the game. Even if you take away from Riggs' comments information that is provably false. Critical Role is, while they have when playing their Candle Obscura games and they're working on a fantasy role-playing system, they're still doing 5th edition, and at no point has Matt Mercer said, oh, Campaign 4 is going to be in our home system. We're not going to be using D&D 5e once the Bell's Hells campaign is done. He hasn't said that. And he has no reason, if he's going to say that, to not say that. Particularly if he wants to hype up the game that he's putting out. Is say, hey, this is the game we'll be using, like, once this is ready, and we'll publish it when it's done. But once it's done, that's what we're using that's what we'll be using from Campaign 4 onward. He has every right to say that, and it certainly helps sales of the game. But even if he did that, that doesn't cause the game industry collapse. Like, Tunnels and Trolls came about because of a person looking at the original Dungeons and Dragons rules, the white pamphlets and the faux wood grain box, looking at the rules and saying, I don't like this. I think, the designer of Tunnels and Trolls, think this is overcomplicated crap. I'm going to write a game system where a character sheet is on an index card, and the only dice you need to use are D6s. Because I don't want to have to be stuck with these cheap plastic dice that you have to ink yourself with a crayon that come in the D&D box. So and for that matter, people going, oh, I want to do a game that's in space, that's with spaceships and based on these classic pulp space opera novels that I enjoy. So I'm going to write Traveler. Or somebody at TSR going, I want to do a Old West game. So I'm going to write Boot Hill. Or somebody going, I want to basically create a 1920s gangsters Bronstein, or gangster movie Bronstein / film noir Bronstein. So I'm going to do the Gangbusters, the original Gangbusters rules. If you read those, they're they're actually really well designed for bronze team style play. So, like, you got that, like, all the way back in the 70s, and never mind once you get into the 80s and the 90s, where you get more and more companies getting involved. And for that matter, in the 90s in particular, you start getting games where you're jumping on or their players are jumping on to tabletop role playing through game systems that aren't Dungeons and Dragons. Famously, the World of Darkness, various games, Vampire and Werewolf and Mage and all of that, Changeling were a big jumping on point for a lot more for players, and in particular women, who felt that the Dungeons and Dragons style of play didn't work for them. And that the way that the White Wolf games described themselves as being more focused on narrative storytelling, literally calling their game system the storytelling system, was more conductive for what they were looking for in a role-playing game. So you take that, you take some of the licensed games coming out, particularly Star Wars from West End Games, and you have those things drawing people into the role-playing game market and the role-playing game hobby in ways outside of Dungeons and Dragons. Even other games from TSR, the licensed Marvel Superheroes role-playing game, the original one, that would have drawn players in as well who were fans of Marvel Comics and bought them because they were fans of Marvel Comics and they wanted to tell their own stories in this framework collaboratively with their friends. So under those circumstances, like, even in TSR, you have other mechanisms into the role-playing game hobby beyond Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons has never been the be-all or end-all. What is happening is not the end of Dungeons & Dragons as a hobby. It is the end of a monoculture. And we have seen in the hobby industry what happens when you get a monoculture and when it collapses. And that is the D20 boom and bust of the late 2000s into the 2010s, when Wizards of the Coast shifted from 3rd edition to 3.5 edition, with the OGL and relevant license stuff, with the D20 license not necessarily linking up with that smoothly, leading to a sense of insecurity and other issues in the market that made that less fit, made that not work as well. With that in mind, is the industry going to collapse with the rise of other game systems? Absolutely not. In fact, like, if you have knowledge of the larger game industry's history, you don't need, like, it's not a question. It's not a speculation. It's very clear cut that having more game systems is fine. In fact, having more game systems is healthy. The industry is at risk. The hobby is at risk. But more often, the industry is at risk when you have a monoculture. If the problem was Dungeons and Dragons is at risk because the OGL collapsed, let's all jump ship to Forged in the Dark and to Powered by the Apocalypse, and then that'd be a problem. You're going from one monoculture to another monoculture. But if the result is Dungeons and Dragons is in peril, the OGL is in peril, we need to, as publishers, we need to go somewhere else and take fans with us. If the response is we're going to all our own different systems that are with our $1 million Kickstarters to fund their publication, that do fund and we do fulfill them, and we go into all these different systems, that doesn't necessarily mean, like, that you don't have a monoculture. Even if all these games are heroic fantasy, dungeon delving, or as I say, dungeon fantasy role-playing games, trying to catch the same vibe as Dungeons and Dragons by having other systems that will play in that style, that will work in that framework, for that narrative and thematic framework, but in different ways, then that's great. Because What happens then is future iterations of Dungeons & Dragons and these other games can learn and riff off the other versions, see what works, see what doesn't, see what fits with what you're trying to do, and pick up from those concepts. Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition and 4th edition, and even 5th edition, were not created in a vacuum, and all of them learned from what other role-playing games were doing. Jonathan Tweet, one of the role-playing game designers of 4th edition, worked on Over the Edge. He also worked on 3rd edition as well, but he worked on Over the Edge and other independent role-playing games with a very heavy narrative focus, and he took what he learned designing those games and what influenced him to make those games and carried that into 3rd edition and 4th edition. Same with Monty Cook, what they were doing narratively at TSR toward the end, and what other publishers were doing, and brought that in to 3rd edition, and would take that on to what was going on in Numenera and the other similar games using that game system design, what would become the Cypher system. So, role-playing games don't exist in the vacuum. The more games there are, honestly, the better from an industry standpoint and from a design standpoint, because the designers who are doing the next version of Dungeons & Dragons, whatever it will come out, maybe, like, whether it's the revisions to 5th that are planned, or could be another decade or more down the road, they will learn from what other game designers are doing, even ones operating in the same space. And so having all these designers working together, not in direct collaboration, but in like the same field, in a way where they can riff off each other, is a good thing. Not having a monoculture is a good thing. And these publishers and designers branching out from the 5th edition rules, going this 5th edition rule set and the OGL and what Hasbro and Wizards are doing with D&D Beyond, and potentially trying to bring people into a single marketplace that's problematic and potentially dangerous for the long-term health of the hobby, if everything's dependent on one storefront for 5th edition in the long term, because that is what happened with 4E. If we take that and we branch out and make this legal ecosystem larger and evolve our systems further, then that's good for the hobby as a whole. That's good for the industry as a whole, and it's good for players as a whole, because us as players and game masters and aspiring game designers and adventure writers, having more options in terms of figuring out what works for us is good. Monocultures in game design are not so good. So what I'm trying to say is D&D is not dead. It is quite the opposite. It is D&D and dungeon fantasy role-playing is alive and well, and what's happening with all these different games putting out is the best possible result. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe. And also consider backing my Patreon. Patreon backers get episodes up to 1 week early of this show and any future Let's Plays. Also, please consider backing my Ko-fi. Toss me a few bucks also helps support the show, and it's not a monthly obligation or anything like that.